Hello sanibonani babukeli, sesifikile thina nohlelo Yilungelo Lakho. It's your right. Mbukeli sizakuwe bukhoma la mahamba phambili phela SABC 1 iMzansi for sure. Mina ke ngo Alisha Inkosazana yakajali. Mbukeli ukhumbule ukuthi asinivaleli neze ngaphandle odabeni sobe silidingida namhlanje. Kuhambeni kwesikhathi sonivulela phela ithuba ukuthi nani nibambe ikhaza ngokuthi nishayele ucingo la e-studio ku 011-714-6918 noma uzame ku 0714-6919. Email yethu ithi consumer@sabc.co.za. Ungasithola futhi ku Facebook noma ku Twitter. Sanibonani babukeli. We may not all own our houses, and renting a place to stay is the only option available to many. Sometimes what starts as a good relationship between the tenant and the landlord can turn toxic, all due to disputes over each party's rights and responsibilities. Now, it is these rights and responsibilities that we hope to tackle in today's program. But before senza lokho, ake sibheke nanku umbiko.
Ukufumana indawo yokufihla inhloko emva koyikhangela ixesha elide yinto ezisa imincili kunye nesiqabu nakophina umuntu obedinga indawo. Kodwa lo mincili ingafikelela esiphelweni ngokukhawuleza xa kuqhambuka impixwano phakathi komnini indawo nalowo uqeshileyo. Umzekelo woko imeko ugqumi emqeni athe wagaxeleka kuyo.
Inkinga enginayo uma stand wami ukhuphule imali ye rent and of which is uthi ibond ikhuphukile ekubeni ebenga renovate lutho ngena renovation and futhi the way akhuphule ngakhona akalandelanga umthetho, the good procedure. Uma ekhuphula nokhuphula ngo 40% like ukusuka ku 900 rand ufaka 600 rand more above. Imali leyo enzima kakhulu ukuthi ngakhuma kuthiwa ukhuphule rent manje use rent ngalolo hlobo leyo.
Umqeni uthi akakwazanga kunyamezela imeko enjalo. Wayangqo kwiziko elilamla izikhalazo zabantu abaqeshisa ngendawo zokuhlala eGauteng, i-Rental Housing Tribunal.
The basic ones that could relate to the non-refund of deposit, the non-payment of rent, the lack of maintenance, evictions. When we talk about eviction, we talk about illegal evictions because we don't deal with legal evictions. So, for example, a lockout merely by changing somebody's locks would be regarded as a dispute. There's maintenance issues that we deal with, and those would be the common ones that we deal with on a day-to-day basis in our office.
Ukwakweliziko apho usomashishini oqeshisa ngendawo yokuhlala uAlfred Adman athe wabizelwa kulo emva kokuba omnye wabantu abahlala kwindawo yakhe walile ukuhlawula irente. Uthi ufunde isifundo esikhulu ngengxaki angene kuyo ngenxa yabantu abamnika ubunzima.
It's an everyday common problem. Every month you got somebody that's either paying rent short. They think, at the end of the day, if you own a building, that we also got accounts to pay. Like they say, they got accounts to pay. They got destiny in the family. We understand this, but the tenant can't make their problems ours. If you go to the city council and tell them, we got two or three of tenants that is not paying, we can't pay the building full, they will cut it. And what do? Other tenants have to suffer, and then at the other day, I won't have one tenant coming, I'll have 20 tenants coming to the housing tribunal and say, we are paying rent, but the owner of the buildings is not paying the electricity and water. Now they've cut it. Now what do?
Eliziko yenye indawo zokuqala abantu abanengxaki bathi babalekele kulo xa befuna isisombululo ngomba wokurenta. Amagoza alo anika izingcebiso zilandelayo kubaqeshi nakubanini bendawo. Abarenti kufuneka bahlawule irente ngethuba, basebenzise indawo ngenkathalo, bachithe inkunkuma ngendlela efanelekileyo, bangaqeshisi ngendawo ngaphandle kwemvume yomnini wayo. Umnini wendawo kufuneka enze indawo ibe semgangathweni wokuhlala phambi kokufumana umuntu kuyo, alungise umonakalo okhoyo oluxanduva lwakhe, afake iinkonzo ngokuzivumelwano sokuqeshisa ngendawo, afake isaziso esibhalwe phansi ukuba indawo yokuhlala iwela egameni lomnye umuntu. Eliziko lithi akuvumelekanga ukukhupha umuntu ngetshova ngaphandle komyolelo wenkundla. Ukuba umnini ndawo uza kunyusa irente, kufuneka anike umqeshi isaziso soko kwangethuba elingayinyanga ezimbini ubuncinane. Abantu bayakhuthazwa ukuba mabawazi amalungelo abo yaye bafune isivumelwano esibhalwe phantsi xa beqesha indawo. Umqeni uncedwe kukwazi amalungelo akhe nalapho ayokufumana khona uncedo lokuwakhusela. Uvuyisile Mdoda, Yilungelo Lakho.
Siyabonga kakhulu ngalo mbiko esiwenzelwe nguvuyisile Mdoda. What are your consumer rights and responsibilities as a tenant? And what are the obligations of your landlord? Well, that's the subject of our discussion today. Ukusiza ukukhuluma kabanzi ngalokho masamukele uMr Jimmy Baloyi yena ovele ku-State Agency Affairs Board. Samukele futhi noMadupi Mohlala ophuma kwa-Gauteng Rental Housing Tribunal. Sinaye futhi Ellen Levy yena ongummeli. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you and thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Afternoon. Thank you for having us.
Now, I just want to understand, asiqale ngawe Bujimi. Bujimi, usichazele ngale publication of Velagion, organization of Velagion.
Okay, the Estate Agency Affairs Board is a board that was established by the Estate Agency Affairs Act with a consumer mandate. We have a mandate to protect the consumer in as far as immovable property is concerned. So we are in the process of establishing provincial offices. At the moment, we've got only one office in Joburg that's serving the entire country.
All right, Sis Mamudupi, as understand, usazise kabanzi nge-Rental Housing Tribunal.
Okay, the Rental Housing Tribunal is also a statutory body set up in terms of the Rental Housing Act. Our main responsibility is obviously to create a balance between the rights of the landlord and tenant. Now, I'm sure you know historically, obviously, the landlords have been dictating to tenants with regard to the terms and conditions of lease. So the Rental Housing Tribunal is set up specifically to provide a free of charge service in order to make sure that rights of landlords and tenants are duly protected at all times.
Thank you so much. And Ellen, what is your core duty as an attorney practicing around rental laws?
I've been practicing for approximately 15 years in the field of property law and landlord-tenant law, and often we're approached by landlords wishing to protect their rights and other times by tenants wishing to protect their rights.
All right. Now, ngicela ukuthi sazi rentals nowadays seem to be the only option. As we heard, we insert ukuthi most young adults and couples are cohabiting very early to try and save the costs. People are sharing property to try and cut the costs as well. But let's understand the advantages and disadvantages of going for rental property. Let's start with you, Ellen.
I think often the decision to rent is not one that's made with options at hand. If you can afford to buy, I think often people would buy. Often those who can't afford to buy or can't get finance to buy would opt for a rental option.
All right. Sis Mamudupi.
Look, I think what's important to understand in relation to our responsibilities and what the Act provides for is that we are there to create a proper bargaining platform for tenants, because in a lot of cases you find that the landlord is powerful, the landlord has money, and they obviously do they intend to dictate the terms and conditions under which they contract. So the Act comes in and says, even if you may have that power, the tenant is an equal participant in this relationship. They have certain rights. They need to be protected. For instance, even in issues around eviction. Eviction is not permissible without a court order. And I think it's also important to understand that eviction is not just about throwing a person out of their house. Even if you deprive a tenant of some of their rights, for instance, a parking space, and if in terms of the lease they're entitled to a parking space or a certain access to the garden, and you deprive them of that, that is also protected in terms of the in terms of the Rental Housing Act, to make sure that a tenant gets all the rights that they're entitled to in terms of the lease agreement.
Okay, but Jimmy, usichazele kabanzi ukuthi yini kahle kahle i-lease.
Okay. A lease is an agreement between the tenant and the landlord in terms of, which agreement regulates the relationship between the two parties. That's where you find rights and obligations on the part of both parties. That's the long and the short, definition of a lease agreement.
Okay, uba no drafter.
Can I just also just add one other important thing that I think tenants also need to understand? Okay, things are yes, ngoba thola ngesikhathi esinye ama tenants akazi uthola ukuthi landlord ikhatheli electricity or uyaqosha athi awubhadalanga rent or ushould payile ne rent aqoshe lezo zinto azivumeleki ngomthetho yes kufanele uyibhadale rent yakho but akuvumeleka ukuthi afike nje akukhiyele or awungatholi access endlini yakho if you landlord ikhatheli electricity or ikhathela amanzi or in any way aka affect ngezinto o entitled to zona sometimes usakuthi nje they just disable the access card yakho bese becanga taxi lockout ngoba akakakhiya umnyango wendlu that is still important ukuthi umuntu azi ukuthi as approach sizamncedisa ukuthi akhona ukuthola access yakho.
Okay, now Ellen, are there laws that govern these rental agreements? Please tell us about them.
As mentioned by my colleague next to me, we have the Rental Housing Act. That's an act which sets out in detail in sections 4 and 5 provisions regarding lease agreements. It's an act which also establishes the Rental Housing Tribunal. Save for the Rental Housing Act, there's not much other legislation governing leases. The law of contracts applies. Anything that the parties reduce to writing and sign constitutes a binding agreement between them.
What about the verbal contracts, Ellen?
That's also an option. Parties entering into a lease can reach a verbal lease between them. There's nothing wrong with that. Or they can enter into a written lease.
All right.
Obviously, as attorneys, we would always encourage a written lease.
Written one.
That would be the best option.
All right, okay. Haike mbukeli yithi sibambe lapho kwamanje sithi shelele ngasayitolo, but before we do that isingikhumbuze ukuthi nawe you can take part in today's discussion by calling us on 011-714-6918 714-6919. I-email address yethu isenjalo uconsume@sabc.co.za. You can also catch us on Facebook noma ku Twitter ungayindawo siyabuya khona manje. Sibambele futhi mbukeli ubamba iqhaza endabeni yethu sithinte ngocingo la e-studio ungasithumela futhi i-email ku consume@sabc.co.za usithole futhi ku Facebook na ku Twitter. Now panel, before siya ku break Mama Dupi ngicela usichazele abantu mhlamba understand ukuthi i-RHT is a government entity usichazele ukuthi nihlangana kanjani ne government.
Okay, now the Gauteng Rental Housing Tribunal, we have rental housing tribunals in seven of the 9 provinces, and they fall under local government, and as fall well, not local government, my apologies, under provincial government, and Tinas fall under the Department of Human Settlements at a provincial government, meaning the entity that is funded by the taxpayer, and the services power is for free of charge, meaning awubhadali a single cent.
Okay.
And into enzeka kakhulu isikhathi esiningi uthola abantu abanane imali yokubhadala rent but bayasaba ukuza before us ngoba babona ngathi they need a lawyer and they can spend money kuma lawyer. They must understand ukuthi thina sappointwa government ukuthi we must simplify izinto. Noma si court of law siyavumela ukuthi sikhulume in vernacular, siyakhuluma ngesintu, akuna problem, si simplify izinto so we simplify noma kwi court process siya explainela ukuthi until you understand ukuthi sikhulumani. Noma lo munye ongalanga bane lawyer i-landlord but umsebenzi wethu ukuthi siexplainele ukuthi asiqhazela until uvisise ukuthi senze umsebenzi njani.
Muthi msiza bonke abantu sesuchazana laba abaqashile emalokishini ama backroom ama garage.
Siza noma ubani obhadala into ebizwa rent noma uhlala ku backroom noma uhlala ku garage. In fact i-act yethu yakhuluma, the act is governor yakhuluma ukuthi i-jurisdiction yethu is that wide. Ngisho nomuntu ohlala ku informal settlement if ubhadala rent if nomuntu unomastand ambhadala rent noma ngabeka amasenke akhe e-backyard lo muntu i-tenant angeza kithi if kune problem. And sesibonile ukuthi abantu abahlala emalokishini bane problem abezi kithi ngoba bacanga sina i-jurisdiction sidina ngama-flat nezinto noma kuwumuntu obeka amasenke emva kwe-charity
noma bengabhalanga ilize sayiniwe nje bekhulumile bavumelana.
Exactly, so long as ubhadala ukusebenzisa leso space thina sine jurisdiction and siyakuncedisa. Into engifuna nje ukuthi ngi-add ukuthi uthola ngesikhathi esiningi abantu abazi ukuthi noma ungayi-victor ama-street committee ngoba sesibona ama-case amaningi lamalanga umuntu ayi-tenant alwe noma-stand then the next thing is-street committee kube yiyo ezakuyimkhipha. Ngisho nange-case enjalo funeke uze kithi thina sizakuncedisa ukuthi ubuyele uyohlala endlini le oyirentile.
Okay, but niyabagqugquzela ababukeli ukuthi bayisayine ilizi ingqono ilizi ebhaliwe.
Yes, in fact umthetho soyachintshwa khona manje. There's an amendment that's in the process of being made whereby now government is going to present a pro forma lease agreement.
Okay.
So that even if you don't sign a lease agreement, if a tenant comes, then the terms and conditions in that pro forma lease agreement will then be applicable. In fact, there's an amendment that's being debated now in Parliament with regard to that.
Izosebenzela wonke umuntu njengoba uqeda ukuchaza ukuthi nasemalokishini sis. All right. Now, Ellen, please explain to us the difference between a landlord and an estate agent.
All right, it's quite a basic difference. The landlord would be the owner of the property. At times it can also be the owner's representative. So if one looks at the front page of a lease, normally you'd see the landlord as the registered owner of the property at the deeds office. Other times you may see another party's name who might represent the owner being the landlord.
All right.
That is the landlord.
All right, so let's take uSihle from Pietermaritzburg. Sihle sakwamukela ehlelweni Yilungelo Lakho, umbono noma umbuzo bhuti.
Hi, Sisi.
Hello, Sisi.
Idi at Pietermaritzburg.
Yebo sis.
Ngiyabonga for the show. First of all, ngifuna ukubuza, I recently came to Pietermaritzburg this year and ngathola internet advert on someone that was renting a place. So ngiye ngayifonela ke, and then we made into ukuthi I can go and view the place. And then I viewed the place, and then she was like, ukhona omunye umuntu eben expectile but akezanga. But because mina I've got the money up front, ngamnikeza imali then anginikeza indawo. Then because I was so desperate, then ngiye ngayithatha indawo ke, but we didn't sign any lease at that moment. Then yathi the next day she gave me rules ukuthi there shouldn't be any visitors. I'm the only person that has to live in the place and everything. So manje, I changed my mind. I was like, you know what, I'm a human being. I need to have visitors around.
Sisihle ukutshela lokho ukuthi awukhona ukuba nama visitor esayithathini i-deposit navumelana ngokuthi uzoyithatha indawo.
Yes, Sisi. So uthatha deposit, then ngitshela after that ukuthi I can't have visitors. Yabo.
Okay.
So ngemanje na then I changed my mind. Mina ngathi, you know what, I feel ukuthi your rules angeke ngisakhona ukuhambelana nazo. So I'd like to have my deposit and my rent back the next day. So manje yena she was like, I'm going to give you e-rent, but imali that I'm not going to give you is e-deposit until I find a tenant. Because when you have costed me ukuthi mina I could have found a tenant, but manje ngitholanga because when we wangena. So the question that I want to ask Mina in this regard is ukuthi was it very lawful for her to do that? Because up until today angakayitholi imali yami back. When I call her, she's like, I haven't found a tenant yet, and she's a lawyer and everything. So she threatens me ukuthi yena she's a lawyer. So I just want to find out, Uguti, was it lawful for her to do that? And Noguti Mina, what is it my right? Am I obliged to Lemali, and what steps can I take?
Sisihle sinaye ummeli la udila ngazo zona lezo indaba sicela ulalele. Ellen, that one is all yours. Basically, she saw an online ad. She went to view the place with the lady. The lady was she had told her that she was expecting somebody to come and rent the property, but that person hadn't pitched. So because she had the money handy and the deposit, she paid the deposit and rent. And then this lady tells her the next day when she's moving in that the rules are you can't have visitors over. You're just going to be the only person on the property. So the lady changed her mind and said, you know what, let me have my deposit and rent back because I need people in my life. So this woman has never given her the deposit back, but she gave her part of the money that she paid for rent. Now she wants to know if is this legal, and she says this lady is a lawyer and she's threatened her with law and everything else. Ellen, what can she do?
Definitely. These situations are often difficult. Obviously...
But is this a common case that you deal with?
It is a very common case. Obviously, if they'd entered into a written agreement, the terms of that agreement would be what was applicable.
It was a verbal agreement between just the two of them.
So when that happens, often it's more complicated. I would say in this case, that first day when she viewed the property, in all likelihood they discussed certain terms pertaining to their oral agreement. For example, the rent that would be applicable, how long she would occupy the property. That is when they formalized the agreement. Those were the only terms of the oral agreement. The next day when the caller came back to the property, the landlord then tried to unilaterally, by herself, impose additional terms, which the tenant never agreed to. those additional terms are not part of the agreement between the parties. As such, they're not binding. If the caller were to come to me as an attorney, I would then address a letter to the landlord saying these terms you've tried to impose are not acceptable to our client. More importantly, they are not reasonable terms which apply to a property that one cannot have visitors. If you're not going to return the deposit, then we're going to institute legal action against you or take you to the rental housing tribunal.
Okay.
As an attorney, one would also have recourse to report that person to the law society.
Sisimamuthi ngamsiza kanjani lo muntu mengeza kunina because akazange azahlale ngisho ukuhlala kule ndawo kodwa imali yakhe isithathiwe.
No, I think I concur with what Alan has said, but I think that's important ukuthi siyazi ukuthi generally you have what they call house rules. But the house rules are just not a unilateral rules that a landlord can put in place. They need to be reasonable and they need to be agreed on between the parties. So what we would look at here is when she cancelled the lease, this lady will phone in, was she reasonable? We weigh against the terms of the house rules. Are they reasonable? And has the landlord taken reasonable steps to mitigate a loss? Meaning, has she taken reasonable steps to get an alternative tenant? Because yes, if a tenant does unilaterally terminate without giving you notice, there is a prospect that they can be held liable for that. But you look at whether or not the landlord has done something to mitigate their loss. You can't sit for 3 or 4 months and still keep on saying, I'm looking for a new tenant, I'm looking for a new tenant. You must do it within a reasonable time. But in this particular case, we would look at the house rules, see that they're unreasonable, and then hold that this lady was justified in terminating the way she did because the house rules of saying you cannot have a visitor are not fair.
Ukuthi ube desperate for indawo and indawo eselokishini so ukufika lapho ubhala ama-lokhuzana ama-lease kuba into yokujikeleza ngale. All right, okay, mbukeli siphinde futhi sithi shwelele ngaseyitolo ungayindawo. Siphinde futhi sikwamukele ohlelweni sisakhuluma ngamalungelo akho mayelana nemithetho phela yokuqasha indawo ohlala kuyona. Mbukeli isheshe usishayele ucingo usithumele email usithinte futhi ku Facebook na ku Twitter. Na Mamuduphi awusichazele njengoba lo sisi echaza ukuthi lo muntu ufike ngakusasa wathi akakhona ukuthi eba nema visitor. Are there certain things nina njenge organization that you recognize as conditions that the landlord has to adhere to?
Okay. Look, as I indicated earlier, there is a thing abused on my house rules. House rules, but you don't have landlord doesn't have carte blanche to put anything. It must be reasonable house rules. Okay. For instance, look, house rule yokuthi ungabi nama visitor it's unfair. You can't just have a blanket rule, but ungalimit the number of visitors. Now landlord needs to consider into the overcrowding because overcrowding is a problem. And it's a problem because you find that then it's overbearing the electricity, it's overbearing into amanzi and sewage and services. So they need to allow our visitors, but within a reasonable measure. So our house rules look at that, the terms and conditions under which you contract with the party. So ibuela namuntu ye lease. But it's important ukuthi umuntu akutshela ngama house rules up front ukuthi mawungena wazi ngawo.
But noma imali umnika yonke into.
Correct. But noma singathola ukuthi noma ungangena ke uthole ukuthi seka wrong usengeza kithi siyawa check ke thina sithi are they reasonable, are they not reasonable. But siza check na ukuthi uunderstandile mawungena. Even uyi lawyer uthi understanding we're not going to accept it. But now student uthi understanding will accept that kind of
thing. Okay, but Jimmy awusichazele in terms of your estate agents imaphi lawo ma rules acisha fane nawo sisi?
Okay, obviously, especially where it's a sectional title, as she has correctly pointed out, there are rules that are put in place by that particular body corporate. But let's say, for instance, it's a house that's not part of the sectional title scheme. In that case, obviously, you need to make sure that the lease agreement includes all those kind of things that need to take care of the problem. Like, for instance, I've seen in most leases people mentioning or specifying the number of occupants that can stay in that particular place. But yeah, and remember, where estate agents and managing agents are involved, it all starts with a mandate. The mandate that exists between the estate agent and the landlord must stipulate exactly what is it that the estate agent or the managing agent must do. Failure on the part of the managing agent or an estate agent to adhere to the terms and conditions of the mandate might lead to disciplinary proceedings being instituted against that particular managing agent.
Senbayisa go sis Mamuduphi angithathe usisithule Alexander sisithule sakwamukela ehlelweni siyabonga ukuthi ubambe ucingo.
Sawubona mama njani?
Siyaphila ma, sicela uqhubeke ngombuzo noma umbono.
Siyaphila. Thina sihlala eAlexander emafletini lawo eRDP. So kunama room ngaphandle. Ama room abasinikeza wona bathi ama rental.
Yebo ma.
Lama room ama rental so basinikeza isikhathi ukuthi abantu bazorenta for isikhathi esithile for 5 years. Then abanye bakhona babebhidlizele imikhukulathi, abanye ababhidlizelwanga. So kunabantu abangazange bakhone ukuthi bathole lama rental nezindlu zama RDP. Abanye bacelela ukuthi bazorenta kodwa azange barente edolobheni. Bathe Alexander kunamuntu orenta. Phezulu ukuthi babelethe imali za ama photocopy wabo belethe nama lokhuza bathini ama payslip ukuthi uzokhona mina ukurenta. Abanye basuke endaweni bebarenta boma 800 bathi uzokhona ukurenta because we renta 350. Kodwa makunamhlanje bahlulekile and masihamba se-tribunal ayekho umuntu osizayo. Sahamba se-public protector akekho umuntu osiza nakhona.
Sisithula mama sisithula sicela usichazele kabanzi ukuthi thina ufuna sikusize kanjani ngoba nangu sisi angakusiza kanti nangu noElen ummeli angakusiza naye sisi.
Kusho ukuthi mama into esifuna ukusizwa ngayo ngoba sinama families angithi njengoba sinama room ngaphandle and then sihlala emafletini. Ama families wethu uthola ukuthi sinama families ukuthi bangahlala kulawo ma room kodwa awukhiphawe abanye abantu abangabhadali irent. Ukuthi bekuthiwe bazobhadala irent ukuthi sikhone ukubhadala ama service mangabe sekhona. Manje bakhala ngendaba ukuthi ama service nathi asiwabhadali.
Okay, ama service aniwabhadali kanjani ma? Anikhokhela ugesi, anikhokhela amanzi. Ngicela uphinde sisithula sikuzwisisa kahle ma.
Ma?
Ngicela uphinde futhi lokho kushilo kokugcina lezi zindlu othi niyazirenta ezeni nini nizi-ownayo?
Isiyazi-owna ama landlord thina sihlala emafletini.
Nama landlord.
Ama-rental.
Okay, manje anibathola abantu abakhona ukuthi bazorenta indawo lapho ngoba bathi ama-service aniwakhokheli?
Ba-occupy abantu already ARP.
Okay.
So labantu abarenti kumanje.
Oh, okay. All right. Siyabonga sisithuli sicela ulalele lapho kumabona kude wakho. I think she's having problems. They've got tenants that they're housing in, but the tenants are actually refusing to pay because they're saying they're not paying for the services. And then they say sisi bathi bazile kunina abatholanga usizo.
Okay. Yes, no, like case akhuluma ngayo usisithuli ngiyayazi, it's a case that predates my tenure there, but I know about the case. And the issue here ukuthi they came to us and then they buy a public protector. Manje you can't have two institutions investigating the same issue. So sesimele ukuthi outcome ye public protector and it's periodically follow up on the public protector to find out how far they with that investigation. Okay. So leo investigation ye public protector ngoba obviously our powers are much broader than our powers. Once totally outcome yaleyo, then it will influence the findings the tribunal. Yes, but I think they've even taken it in the portfolio committee, the provincial portfolio committee of human settlements is dealing with case.
All right, siyabonga kakhulu sisi. So abanye abantu abanenkinga enjalo bangeza kunina before beya kuma nakuma public protect. All right, now Ellen, we spoke about something about rules that people need to actually read and understand before signing. What's the importance of this?
Well, any document that you sign today, you've got to read very carefully and make sure you understand it before you sign it. The Consumer Protection Act, which started in 2011, sets out, as I recall in Section 48, that legal documentation where the Act applies must be in simple and understandable language. That's an obligation upon the party drafting the documentation.
I'm here to see a lease in Zulu, Ellen.
So my advice to anyone signing an agreement, especially a tenant out there, is read the lease very carefully. If you don't understand something, mark it with a pencil mark and have someone explain that to you. If you're not happy to sign it, contact the other party and cross out that clause or amend that clause. Do not sign something that you don't understand, which can down the line cause problems for you. That's not the way to go about things.
All right, thank you very much, Ellen. Mbugeli cha asibophe lapho le ndaba for a minute ungathivu. Welcome back mbukeli, asiqhubeke nendaba yethu mayelana nokubaluleka kokwazi amalungelo akho mayelana nokurent indawo ohlala kuyona. My guests in studio are Mr. Jimmy Baloyi, yena ovela kwi-Estate Agency Affairs Board. Sinaye noMamudupi Mohlala ophuma kwa-Gauteng Rental Housing Tribunal. Sibe naye futhi no-Ellen Levy, yena ongummeli. Sithinte manje usizakale mbukeli. Ake sibheke ke manje ukuthi nisibhaleleni lapho ku-Facebook. Let's take a look at some of your Facebook messages. All right, siqale ngoloyiso Sabo Lloyd uphinde futhi usibhalele. Siyabonga bhuti. Your responsibilities as a tenant is that you should pay rent in time so that you cannot be kicked out and become homeless. Thank you very much Loyiso. Siyathemba ukuthi siyafisa ukuthi wonke umuntu was that responsible mayelana nendawo yokuhlala. Simphiwe Cypher says tenants must make sure that they pay rent on time. I mean, if you can't pay, I feel the landlord has the right to throw you out without giving you 2 to 3 months notice, because that's really inconvenient for the landlord and other tenants who pay on time. Tenants shouldn't make their problems mine as the landlord, and definitely should not make their lack of planning my emergency. Wow, thank you very much Sipiwe. Brian Mokhale says, if the tenant is moving out of the building, does the landlord have to pay back the deposit money to the tenant, and should the interest amount be included or not? Brian Mokhale, Ellen, do you want to take that one?
Definitely. Just touching on the last question first. As soon as the tenant is going to vacate the property, the landlord has a certain amount of days in terms of the Rental Housing Act to refund the deposit.
Okay.
As I recall, it's 14 days. The landlord is entitled, after a joint inspection between the tenant and the landlord at the premises, to deduct any damages that the tenant has done to the property.
Okay.
If that is the case, I think the period of 14 days is extended to 21 days.
Okay.
After which the full deposit or the reduced deposit must be refunded. Regarding the interest, the Rental Housing Act does say that the landlord has to invest the deposit in, as I recall correctly, a savings account for the benefit of the tenant.
Okay.
And on the ending of the lease, the deposit with the interest must be returned to the tenant.
All right. Sisi, I guess sisheshe nje sirepe icase kaSisihle Marispect, because I'm sure usayibuza ukuthi kahle kahle indaba yakhe asikayirepi. What can she do now sisi ukuthi athole le mali yakhe back?
No, usisa ngahamba approach i-Rental Housing Act Rental Housing Tribunal yase KZN. Ikhona nase KZN aba-approach ademand i-deposit yakhe, then they will convene a hearing between yena ne-landlord, but discuss le ndaba, and if bathola ukuthi kufuneka i-refund i-deposit, then refund. But bazawuza both sides of the story by resolving matter.
All right, asiqhubekele phambili. Jimmy, this now, a landlord could possibly be the owner, like we said earlier on, of said rental property, who then monitors them on the rates that they charge. Let's say things like spare rooms inside the house or cottages. Who monitors that?
Okay, obviously, if this particular managing agent is the owner of that property, we take out the fact that this person is a managing agent.
Okay.
It's his own property.
Okay.
Now, that relationship will fall within the realm of Sesma Midupi,
Okay.
the Rental Housing Tribunal, because then it's a tenant-landlord issue.
Okay.
But where a managing agent is managing this property on behalf of another person in return for some sort of gain, obviously that falls within the jurisdiction of the Estate Agency Affairs Board. Whatever goes wrong in that relationship, they have to come back to us. But I also want to touch on the issue of the interest. Yes, once again, where there's no involvement of an estate agent or a managing agent, obviously the interest will be governed in terms of the Rental Housing Act. But where a managing agent is involved, Section 32 of the Estate Agency Affairs Act regulates that. The owner, the tenant, must, at the time when he's entering into that agreement, must indicate exactly what is it that they want to happen to their interest. In the absence of any such mandate, then 50% of that interest will go to the Estate Agency Fidelity Fund of the Estate Agency Affairs Board, and 50% the managing agent will retain.
Okay. Ellen, am I able to, as a tenant myself, get another tenant and ask that tenant to pay a deposit to me without the agent or the landlord actually knowing about this? Is this legal?
All right, let's paint a simple scenario. You've got a landlord and a tenant, and let's say, for example, there's no managing agent involved. The tenant now is moving to another part of the country, and they want to find their friend or a relative to move into the property. That is normally allowed. It's called subletting.
Okay.
If, for example, in the main agreement between the original landlord and tenant, it prohibited subletting, then that is a binding contract and subletting would not be allowed. If it allowed subletting, then subletting would be allowed. If no mention was made of subletting, then in my opinion, subletting would also be allowed. The tenant would then, with their relative or friend, whoever it was, enter into an oral agreement or a written agreement, which would govern their relationship. You would then have their relationship and the other relationship, which would in total govern the use of the property, the exchange of funds, obligations and rights between all of them.
Okay, but Jimmy, mina ngiyi-tenant ngirenta ku-agent already ne-room engalirenti ngifuna ukuthi ngisave imali without telling the agent, am I allowed ukuthi ngilethe umuntu ozohlala lapha azakhokha i-deposit kimi?
Look, that happens a lot in the industry actually.
Yes.
But as I said, I think that problem can be cured by the landlord, specifying the amount of people that can occupy.
Absolutely.
But in the absence of that, I personally, I could be wrong, I personally don't see anything wrong. If, for instance, this unit, it's a 2-bedroom unit, and I'm staying all by myself, the rental is 5,000. I'm allowed to rent one room out to someone else who could pay 2,500
so
and
we
I
share
pay.
half,
We
yes.
share half, half.
But is that allowed?
I'm not aware of anything in law that's against that.
All right, let's take Mr. Mthetho on the line. Mr. Mthetho, siyakwamukela ohlelweni?
Okay, manje.
Siyakwamukela bhuti, sicela uqhubeke nombuzo noma ngombono.
Okay, I've been violated a lot by the landlord. Actually, it's true. So the other one, the recent one, says I got a better offer during the month, and then there was no electricity in the area. We had a small baby and all that. We were struggling in that area. So we found a better offer to move from the flat to a house. So when we did that, we told her. She said that I forfeited the deposit money.
Awusichazele futhi bhuti ufike wahlala kule ndawo wasuyahamba emva kwesikhathi esingakanani nje bengafuni ukunika i-deposit.
Okay, and it's 1 month, and then after it's just 1 month, and then during the month there was electricity problem in the area, water and all that, and we were struggling with a small baby as a young married couple.
Okay.
We told her that we are going to be moving out before we found a place, but then we found a better offer. And then when we were moving out, she said, because I told her during the month, I forfeited the money for the deposit.
Oh, but okay. I-agreement mhlambe bithi isikhathi esingakanani lesi enizohlala lapha?
No, there were no agreements at all. We just stayed there. It's like posted the rent, her rent in the shopping complex, and then I called number, and then we met her, and then when we went there, she never set down any basic rules or any scope. Like there was nothing that binds us together.
Okay.
Or what can I say? Like the bottom line rules of how we should be dealing with each other from the time I get there, we get there, and from the time we go out.
Okay, all right, bhuti siyabonga sicela ulalele ngibona kude sokuphendula emva kwaleli ikhefu sekufike leso sikhathi futhi mbukeli sokuthi isikhokhe zethu ikweletu hlala nathi sizobuya manje sesivale uhlelo. Really welcome back to our final segment. Sheshu sithinte ngocingo nge-email naku Facebook naku Twitter. Mr. Mthetho, here is your answer. Sisi ngicela ukuphendule ubaba.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Mthetho, basically what happens is that if you don't have a lease or any agreement in place, or a fixed term lease, let me put it that way, because you can't not have a lease. It's either a verbal lease or it's a written lease. If you don't have a fixed term lease that speaks to the period in which you must actually be in occupation, then what then happens is that you are governed by a month-to-month lease. And in terms of a month-to-month lease, before you vacate, you must give 30 days notice. And when we talk about 30 days notice, we're not talking about a calendar month. It doesn't have to be the first to the end of the month, so long as you give a 30-day period within which to the landlord to say that you're vacating, then you can vacate without any penalties with regard to that.
So ngebhadi ubhuti ngekakhona ukuyithola ideposit yakhe because lezo insuku bezingakapheli.
Correct. You are supposed to at least give that 30-day notice period.
Okay.
May I just add one thing there?
Yes, Ellen.
The caller, if the landlord is in breach of the lease agreement, i.e. he's broken the lease. If I heard the caller correctly, there was an issue with electricity.
Yes, there was an issue with electricity.
If the landlord has breached the lease or the law in his obligation to provide electricity, then the tenant can put the landlord under breach, and if he doesn't rectify his breach by providing the electricity, he can then cancel the lease.
Okay.
If he then cancels the lease, that can all be done, let's say, for example, in a 7-day period. Once that 7 days is completed, the tenant then has no obligation towards the landlord after that. The lease has been cancelled. And the landlord must then pay back to the tenant.
So he should have cancelled the lease. That's what he should have done, basically.
But I think we need to just take this in context. There is no written lease in this particular context. So you can't necessarily say that. And my understanding of the way he put it is that there was no electricity in the area. So it was a power cut situation whereby it's not an act. Yes, it wasn't an act by the landlord. It was a power cut situation in that particular area, which means the landlord did not have control over the situation. Not unless, obviously, it's a situation where the landlord of their own accord cuts off the electricity, then that's a different issue. But my understanding, I think Mr. Mteto can clarify, but my understanding was that there was a power cut situation in the area. For instance, an ESCOM power cut, which the landlord is not of the doing of that particular landlord.
All right, very quickly, Cici, what is the sole purpose of deposit?
Okay, I think it's very important to explain this. A deposit really is there to make sure that when you give a premises is given to you in a certain state, it's returned in a certain state. So I think it's all very important that I emphasize that when tenants take occupation of a property, they must insist on a joint inspection with the landlord, meaning that they must inspect to see what is the state of the premises, and if there are any problems, they must reduce it to writing, and both parties must sign for it. So that when they leave and they start demanding their deposit, and there must be a further inspection, which is called an exit inspection, and they must sign for that. So that what happens then at the end, you compare the entry inspection and the exit inspection. If there are any damages that were there when you took occupation, then you can't be held liable for it when you leave. And a lot of tenants don't know this, so it's quite critical they understand that, and that goes to the heart of whether or not you get your deposit back. So you must insist as a tenant, and if the landlord then refuses to do that, refuses to undertake the entry and exit inspection, then it is deemed in terms of the Act that the premises were in a fit and proper state, and you must get your deposit back. The Act is very clear on that one.
Okay, Jimmy, on what grounds can agent refuse to give back tenant deposit here?
Remember, an agent basically is governed by the mandate that exists between him and the landlord. If, for instance, in terms of that mandate, the estate agent has to make sure that when this property is returned back to the landlord, is in a good state. The circumstances under which an estate agent can refuse to refund are those that will allow the estate agent to make sure that the property is in a very good state of repair when it's being returned.
It's just basically, it's a surety thing as well.
It's a surety
to protect
thing.
both the owner's rights as well.
Yes.
All right. Okay, let's take our final Facebook message there. Let's see what you have written to us. Lisbeth Puseleto Likotoko says, in 2009, I signed a contract with an agent using the said agency name. After 6 months, the owner came and told me he never received a cent for rent, and the agent disappeared. We changed bank accounts and I paid the owner directly. 6 months later, I received a letter from court that we will be evicted. When I called the owner, he said I must not worry. Then I called the sheriff's office. They said they will give us a chance to look for another place. The caretaker of the building also said he was not paying his rates and we were paying rent. When I asked the owner for my deposit, he said I must call the agent that disappeared, but I dealt with the agent that was carrying out this instruction. To date, I never got my deposit. I still have all the documents. Ellen, what can they do? A dozen tapestry of problems there. There's too many things that went wrong with that lease, that agreement.
That was a little bit of a long story, and I hope I followed it correctly. But ultimately, if there is a written lease, the tenant must just make sure that he pays the landlord into the bank account which the lease should set out. As long as he does that, he's fulfilled his terms of the contract. So that's the important thing.
Jimmy?
Yeah, what I want to say is, I think I cannot overemphasize the fact that, where estate agents are involved, people must check with us if this person is legit, if this person is properly registered. For someone to disappear, for an estate agent to disappear with a deposit, obviously it's a contravention of the Act as well as the Code of Conduct. So they need to report that person. Whatever information they have on that person, they must approach us and give us that information.
Okay.
We will try by all means. If this person is not registered, we lately engage the services of tracing agents to try and locate those people and bring them to book.
All right, and it's a good thing, I suppose, because we pay on deposits, slips and everything.
If I might just add, I don't know, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, isn't there also a fidelity fund whereby if it is a registered agent and they disappear, then you can get compensated from the fidelity fund? We always advise parties to actually approach the estate agency affairs board so that they can get compensated. So it's like the attorney's profession. If you get an ethical attorney, you get compensated because so that the public does not suffer. So we contribute so that at the end of the day, negligence by an agent doesn't prejudice the tenant.
Yeah, but that's actually very true. And in fact, the good thing, as I said earlier when we started, we have a consumer protection mandate.
Yes.
And how does that come about? We regulate the activities of estate agents. And in terms of the current act, which we are in the process of repealing, in terms of the current act, whether or not this person is registered as an estate agent, as long as this person passed themselves off as an estate agent and they disappear with your funds, you have recourse against our fund. Our fund will investigate that and you will be refunded.
Very interesting news there indeed. Now, this is a big question that people always ask. Can the landlord take my possessions if I fall behind on rent? Alan?
There exists a legal term called the landlord's hypothek. What that means, according to my understanding, is that the landlord has a right to the tenant's possessions on the property in security for what's owed to him in rental.
Okay.
Practically, that doesn't mean that if the tenant doesn't pay the rental by the 2nd of the month, that the landlord can march in, load up his trailer and go to cash converters.
Okay.
What it means is that the landlord can issue what's called a rent interdict summons in terms of the Magistrates Court Act, where the sheriff marches in, serves the summons on the tenant and writes up an inventory of all the furniture and assets, which after the court gives judgment, the landlord can, with the sheriff's assistance, remove and sell to recover the rental.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, Mamudu.
Just a quick issue. The issue of the landlord's hypothek, it comes up a lot of the time, and I'm glad that Alan said this, but there must be a summons before you can. There must be a court process. You can't actually laterally without a court process. There must be a process undertaken.
All right. So basically, ngeke ikwazi landlord ukuthi ifike njengoba esho Ellen izothatha izinto
uyakhona, but aye court kuqala, he must get order eshowo ukuthi he's entitled.
Thank you
so
very much.
So that's the important issue.
Thank you very much. Well, babukeli ngebhadi isikhathi sethu sesibaleke nenje yikho lokho besiniphathele kona emgodleni wethu wanamhlanje. Ngithanda ukubonga izivakashi zethu ngesikhathi nolwazi labo. Ngiphinde ngibonge nani babukeli phela ngokubamba iqhaza odabeni lethu namhlanje. Ukhumbule ukuthi siyatholakala la kumahamba phambili SABC 1 Mzansi for sure ngomsombuluko ngo-10 kuya ku-11 a.m. for impinda yohlelo lethu. Join us again next week for another live consumer topic of the week from the team and myself, u-Alisha Ntokazi yakajali. Nisale kahle babukeli.
Yilungelo Lakho.